Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings to all those who are on hookup and joining us. Now, the question is whether I'll pay any attention to this or not. Let us hope I do. It was a dark and stormy night. No, seriously, it really was. It really was. 12 men were stuck in a small boat. They had a most interesting full range from low to high day. They had learned that a good friend had died a gruesome death the night before. And they witnessed an absolutely amazing miracle. Nearly 15,000, if you consider women and children, people had been fed miraculously from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And when they cleaned up the leftovers, there were 12 baskets full. They had been dismissed by their leader to go out into the ocean or to the sea and make their way to the other side. And he was going to stay back and disperse the people, go pray for his lost friend, and seek guidance. And they were to get across the other way. Now, obviously, we all have a pretty good idea who these 12 guys were. The disciples. And they also know that these guys weren't exactly, wallflowers. They could have a conversation. And considering everything that they had gone through in the last 24 hours, they had a passel of things to talk about. And no doubt they did. So we also know that in this group, there were at least 4, maybe 7 of them were fishermen. That meant they knew this body of water. They knew how to maneuver the boats. They knew how to row. They knew how to set sail. And they knew that they had to get from point A to point B. And the distance they had to travel was roughly 6 to 8 miles. And yet, it finds themselves at 3 o'clock in the morning, bucking an incredibly serious wind that just stopped them. They were in trouble. The boat was about to capsize. And they knew maybe they chewed the fat too long. Maybe they discussed the situation. But they found themselves in a real pickle. And to top it off, they look out and here's this thing making its way past the boat. Ah! They're screaming, "It's a ghost!" Well, this thing just happened to be their leader, Jesus Christ. And he calls out to them. Actually, he just says to them. Call out kind of intimates that he yelled. He just said to them, "Be of good cheer." Interesting way of saying this in the middle of a raging sea. Frightened men, be of good cheer. It is I. Don't be afraid. Faith in God requires a spiritual response to overcome our carnal reaction. Let me read that. Faith in God requires a spiritual response to overcome our carnal reaction. We're going to focus on a single part of Matthew 14 on Peter's element in this. I refer to Peter as the hood ornament of the disciples. He was out there in front, pushing the wind, catching the bugs, always saying something you saw him first. And of the 12, he's the one who steps up to the boat and says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water and meet you." And Christ's reply was, "Come on." Now, any sane person in the middle of a raging sea with waves, who knows how big they are. They're not making any forward motion. It's late. He steps off the side of the boat. He's lost his marbles. Or he's 100% moving in faith. In other words, he's had a spiritual response. He stepped off of the boat into the waves and became the first, well, let's say the second human to walk on water. And he walked on water until he had a carnal reaction. And that carnal reaction was he looked down. He looked around. And what happens if you're a baseball player and you're told to pitch right towards the batter, and you look over at first base? Where's that pitch going to go? Now, unless you've trained yourself, it's going to go someplace other than the strike zone. He took his eyes off of Christ. He broke that connection. The spiritual response connection broke, and he started to sink. Peter's question, Lord, if it be you, Christ's answer, come. Peter's response, he came off the ship, walked across the water. Christ's response, not recorded. Peter's reaction, he saw around him the boisterous water and began to sink. Now, Peter's second response is what we want to focus in on. Peter used a spiritual response in recognizing Christ. Now let's kind of back up a second and take note of something that kind of missed when we talk about this. Because I asked myself, Peter, we're knowing Peter, he's kind of out there. Lord, if it's you. They thought it was a ghost. How did he know the ghost wasn't going to say, hey, come on? Got one. Because when Christ responded, just as we're told in John 10:27, the sheep know the voice of the shepherd. When Christ responded, they knew his voice. So, boom, Mr. Peter, he's out there. We're going. And he's walking on the water. And then he becomes Peter. But the response, not the reaction that he gave, is what we want to focus on. Did he lunge for the boat? Think about it. Where was that boat now? Everybody who's a sailor or goes out on the water knows you stay with the boat. You know, and if you're swept overboard, you're getting back to the boat. He did not do that. He reached out. He responded, save me, Lord. He didn't fall back on a carnal reaction. It is a very important lesson for us to take at this point. Peter did not react by lunging for what would appear normally to most humans the sensible thing to do. Peter chose to respond. He chose to reach to God. He focused as if the mind of God was guiding him, a spiritual response. This incident shows us also the next thing. Christ responded immediately. He stretched forth his hand and saved him. And then he looks at him and says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, Christ wasn't reprimanding Peter. He was just making a statement. You of little faith. He recognized for Peter to step off of that boat into a raging sea. He was a fisherman. He knew full well the ramifications of stepping off a boat into a raging sea was not going to end good. But he did it. So he had to have a tremendous amount of faith. It just was kind of temporary because it started to vacillate, and this is what we need to learn. We have ingrained carnal reactions. We need to gain spiritual response. And when we start vacillating between the two, we become a double-minded person. We're not making a choice. And Christ says, make the choice. You're either hot or cold. Respond as with a spiritual intent, or you're going to react with a carnal. You can give all kinds of negatives on that one. But it's carnal. It's of the flesh. Hebrews 12:2 shows us that looking to Christ as the author and the finisher of our faith. This incident is an important lesson for us to learn in our daily challenge to develop godly faith. It directly addresses the reality of not if we run into a moment of spiritual weakness, but when we do. It gives us the how to do, the manual. We look to Christ. He is the author and the finisher. Have faith. Keep the faith. Set the mind to not lunge for the boat. Do not trust in self. We must avoid that trap of vacillating between the two. Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not to your own understanding. No matter how right it might feel to react, time out. There's another way. Respond. Have the good sense to respond and walk on the water with God, even when it makes no sense at all. Matthew 14 shows us clearly the 12 disciples were in the midst of a great tempest and grave danger, not unlike the times we see before us now. The disciples needed help. So do we. Christ was there for the 12 disciples. He is here for us. All we have to do is respond. Save me, Lord. Christ taught and used Peter and this example to provide us a very clear lesson. It wasn't a parable. There's no clouding. It is clear as a bell. For all who read and have an ear to hear, spiritual response is necessary when dealing with life's tempests. Faith in God requires a spiritual response to overcome our carnal reactions. Peter's actions provide clarity in the value of a spiritual response over a carnal reaction. It's the good sense to reach for God and not lunge for the boat.